Okay, hello everybody, and welcome to another presentation of the online ColdFusion meetup. I'm Charlie Earhart, and I'll be your host for the next hour or so. And this edition of the meetup, our 284th, being recorded on Thursday, March 11th, 2021 at noon U.S. Eastern Time. We've got David Byers, who's going to give us a talk called ColdFusion 101, Introduction to ColdFusion for Beginner Developers, Decision Makers, and CEOs. All right, awesome. And David, go ahead and take it away. Thank you for coming on.
Thanks, Charlie. This presentation is called Introduction to ColdFusion for Beginner Developers, Decision Makers, and CEOs, but let's call this what it really is. This is ColdFusion 101. So who this presentation is, of course, my slides jump ahead. So who this presentation is for, let's talk about why my presentation likes to toy with me the moment that I start. All right, so this presentation is for people who are new to development. It is for people who have an idea of a software project but don't know how to get it done. It's for people who are curious about ColdFusion, and it's for people who are using ColdFusion and wondering if or why they should keep using it. This presentation is not really for people who aren't involved in the development process. If you have nothing to do with the development process whatsoever, either as a developer or a manager of developers or somebody who works with the software development team, you're not going to get much out of this. This really isn't for ColdFusion developers because you guys should already know this stuff. It's not for people who believe that ColdFusion is dead or have a bias against it in favor of some other language. If you're coming in here saying, you know, I love PHP and it's the best thing ever and nothing can ever beat it, you know, I'm not here to change your mind. That's not my role. Today, we're going to learn the basics of how the web works, and I do mean basic. We're going to talk about the basics of how ColdFusion works. We're going to talk about some simple ColdFusion syntax. We'll discuss some of the major ColdFusion frameworks. I'll give you an overview of the ColdFusion developer community and how to find various ColdFusion resources. And then we'll go through some facts and misconceptions. What you're not going to learn today is how to install ColdFusion. Plenty of tutorials out there on how to do it. I don't need to tell you how to install ColdFusion. You're not going to learn specifically how to be a ColdFusion developer. That takes years of practice and training. You're not going to learn the answer to a specific problem you might be having in ColdFusion. But you're also not going to hear me say ColdFusion is the absolute best and that's the end of the story, because ultimately, ColdFusion is a single tool in a very large toolbox, and you should use whatever tools are available to you in order to be able to, get the job done. So by the end of this session, you should know the fundamentals of what ColdFusion is, how it works from a 10,000-foot view perspective. You should be able to talk the basics of about ColdFusion with a developer without your eyes completely glossing over, and hopefully you're going to have a little fun. So, of course, we have to have the obligatory biography slide. My name is David Byers. I am a certified Adobe ColdFusion specialist. I've been a web developer for over 20 years. I am CTO at Epicenter Consulting, which is a New York-based company that specializes in ColdFusion development, but we are a full-service agency and do a lot more than that. I'm active on the ColdFusion Community Portal at coldfusion.adobe.com. I'm a bit of a raconteur. All that means is I tell stories, as you'll find out pretty quickly. And I live in Las Vegas with 3 cats, 4 house bunnies, and a bearded dragon named Gary, thanks to my wife. And believe me, the animals rule the roost. But I wasn't always a developer. See, I grew up in rural Nova Scotia, Canada. And when I came home after school, I used to watch sitcom reruns on TV. There was one that I really enjoyed during the 80s called WKRP in Cincinnati, about a ragtag group of people who run a rock radio station. Specifically, I kind of gravitated towards this guy. Fantastic role model. Guy's name was Dr. Johnny Fever, and he was always the coolest guy in the room. And I thought that was, he was a great guy and really cool. I wanted to be him when I grew up. So after high school, I went to college. I got a job at a local radio station that had a bit of attitude, as you can tell.
Comp 92.3, the station with a heart. We keep it in a fridge down the hall.
And I started kind of living a rock star lifestyle. I was the station's promotion director. So here's me in the Mid 90s, it's me. Hold on, me, Ted Nugent. There's one of our other disc jockeys, and Charlie pointed out to me that my green screen makes it look like I'm grabbing his derriere here. But anyway, I was the one who was responsible for figuring out how the radio station gave away all the good, fun toys that we gave away on the air. Well, one day I get a message from the record company that says that Motley Crue is going to be coming to Las Vegas, and they're going to be giving me a pair of front row tickets to give away to this concert. And they say, David, we want you to give away these front row tickets, but it's got to be fun. It's got to be creative. It's got to be, really promote the show and the rock lifestyle and so on and so forth. I'm like, okay, great. What am I going to do with this? Well, at the time, the drummer for Motley Crue, Tommy Lee, was married to Pamela Anderson, and they had various adult scandals going on in their lives. They were probably one of the first celebrity sex tapes that accidentally got released and all sorts of fun things. So we came up with this idea where we were going to take a balloon and we were going to attach a coupon to the front of that balloon for these front row tickets. Then we were going to fill that balloon with gas, and we were going to let the balloon loose over the city of Las Vegas. Okay? That's great. Whoever brings us the coupon for the front row tickets from the balloon gets the front row tickets. Except we didn't use a balloon. And normally in my presentation, I try to keep this very family friendly, but here I'll just say it. We used a blow up doll. We took a blow up doll and we dressed it in trampy clothing, and we called that Pamela Anderson. And then we took that balloon and we let it loose over the city of Las Vegas. Now, you might be wondering, you're probably asking, what the hell does any of this have to do with ColdFusion or software development or anything? What this really taught me, I'm getting there, don't worry. What this really taught me is how to learn to solve problems logically and be detail-oriented. I know this is a stretch, bear with me. But there's a lot of decisions, a lot of concepts that go into a promotion like this. Like, how do we execute on it? We don't want to just let the balloon go and have it go flying off, never to be seen from again. What are the risks involved? How do we affix the coupon to it? We don't want it to fall off. Do we use duct tape? What happens if it hits a power line? Are we going to black out part of Las Vegas by doing this? Is the intended audience going to embrace this idea? We want people to be chasing this balloon. So are they going to, or are they going to do what some of our listeners did and try shooting at it in order to bring it to them? So we had to go on air and say, please do not shoot at the balloon. This was back in 1995. And at the time, the radio station used to broadcast the Super Bowl live on the air. It was the 49ers and Chargers. I think the 49ers won. But for me, it was the first major appearance of URLs on commercials. As I'm sitting there watching the game in the studio while we're running it on the air, I start seeing things on commercials like Pepsi.com and Nike.com and Budweiser.com. And that really stuck with me. So the very next day, I went in to the president of Lotus Broadcasting, who runs the radio station, a guy named Tony Benici. And I said, Tony, we need to build some websites for the radio station. And I'll never forget his response. He looked at me square in the eye and he dropped his shoulders and he sighed heavily. And he said, seriously, do you really think this internet thing is going to take off? And I kind of chuckled under my breath. And I said, yeah, I got a feeling it's going to be big. So he said, look, you can do it, but you're getting no extra time and you're getting no extra budget. You're not getting any extra anything. So if you want to build a website for the radio station, go ahead. So I skipped off down the hall. Yay, I'm going to go build websites for the radio station. That's when I kind of clued in. I have no idea how to build a website for the radio station, which brought me to my first logical problem that I needed to be able to resolve. And that's the A to Z of a web request. I didn't even know how the web worked at the time. See, a lot happens on your computer from the moment that you say, bring up Disney.com. Let's bring it back around to family friendly. The first thing that your computer has to do is it has to ask, do I even know where Disney.com is? And if it doesn't, it has to go out to the internet and it has to get a response from what's called a DNS server. That DNS server, your computer asks, where's Disney.com? The DNS server will respond and it'll say that exists at this IP address. Great. Now your computer knows where Disney.com is. So then your computer goes out and it says, hey, this IP address, can it serve me up Disney.com, please? And that response goes to another server, which then says, yeah, all right. And sure enough, Disney.com comes up on your computer. That's the A to Z of it. Your computer makes a request, server sends the response, bingo, bango, you've got the website. But that server is doing a lot as well. It has to make a lot of decisions on how to serve and what to serve. So it has to ask itself, do I even have a website called Disney.com? Where's it located on my local hard drive? What's the default file that needs to be sent? And then it has to gather all of this information up and send it back to the requester, which at the time, again, this is 95, was really easy because all websites, or most websites at the time, were static. Whatever was in the file was what got served to the requester, and that was it. There wasn't a whole lot of pre-parsing or processing going on those websites whatsoever. So before I move any further, does anybody have any questions on how web requests work? Anyone? Nobody? I'm fine with that. Probably giving them a second to type. Okay. Look, we're going to move on, just so that I'm not boring the crap out of everybody. So it didn't take too long before the president of the radio station came back to me and said, he's starting to get on board with this whole internet thing that he didn't think was going to take off. So he comes up to me and he says, David, I want you to add today's date to the top of the website. And I said, okay, at the time, again, mid to late 90s, this was the cool thing. Everybody had site last updated on their website, or today's date, something to show that your content was refreshed and relevant and current rather than, who knows how old. So he comes to me with this request and I'm asking myself, okay, how am I going to pull this off? Because I have no idea how to do this. So I came up with a solution. It was absolutely horrible. It was the worst solution I could have come up with. Here's my idea. I'm going to stay up until midnight. I'm going to download the homepage file. I'm going to change the date. I'm going to re-upload the homepage file, and then I'm going to be done. And that's a horrible, horrible solution because 7 days a week, it meant staying up until midnight, downloading the homepage file, changing the date, uploading the homepage file, and then being done. Tuesday, stay up till midnight, repeat the process. Wednesday, stay up till midnight, repeat the process. Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. And as promotion director of the radio station, I did not want to do this all the time. I was working with the morning show, so I was getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning, staying up till midnight just to change a stupid file wasn't feasible. I was losing too much sleep. And I did what every good developer says when they find a process that needs to be automated. They said, can't somebody else do this? So my question was, how do I take that static website, that static page that doesn't do anything, and turn it into something parsed or pre-processed? And that's when a friend of mine said, you really need to check out Adobe ColdFusion. At the time, it was a layer ColdFusion. What is ColdFusion? So ColdFusion is a server-side Java pre-parser that turns ColdFusion markup language, CFML, into Java bytecode for handling of web server requests. CFML pages get pre-processed on the server. Java bytecode classes get dynamically created that act as page handlers for incoming web server requests. That's a long, boring technical explanation. Quite honestly, I don't even remember where I got it. It could have been me that just came up with it. But what changes is that A to Z of a web request. The A to Z of a ColdFusion web request is a little bit different. Your computer then goes out over the internet, hits that web server. The web server then passes that request off to a ColdFusion server, which parses the content beforehand, sends it back to the web server, back over the internet, back to your computer. Now, I've been using the term ColdFusion a lot, and I want to make a distinction here because this is important. A lot of developers will refer to ColdFusion when really there is two sides of ColdFusion. There's ColdFusion Server, and then there's ColdFusion Markup Language. Okay, ColdFusion Server is the software that runs on the web server. It parses CFML, the language, into Java bytecode. ColdFusion markup language, or CFML, is the programming language that gets interpreted by the ColdFusion software. It consists of tags and functions, and it can be written in tag-based or script-based fashion. Oh, got to dodge words there for a moment. Like I said, originally, it was created by JJ and Jeremy Allaire of Allaire Corporation back in the 90s. Version 1 was released by Allaire in 1995. Allaire was acquired by Macromedia in early 2001. Macromedia was then acquired by Adobe in April of 2005. Over the years, there have been many releases of ColdFusion. And, looking at a timeline going all the way back to the mid-90s, Allaire released versions of ColdFusion pretty consistently up through November of 99 with ColdFusion 4.5. That's when Macromedia purchased Allaire. They released ColdFusion 5 in 2001, ColdFusion MX in June of 2002, and then ColdFusion MX7 in February of 2005. That's when Adobe purchased Macromedia, and Adobe started doing releases with ColdFusion 8, 9, 10, 11. At ColdFusion 11, they changed the naming scheme, so they stopped doing numbered releases and started doing year releases. So after ColdFusion 11 came ColdFusion 2016, then ColdFusion 2018, and then just this last November, Adobe ColdFusion 2021. So you can see lots of releases, very steady release schedule. It's been supported very well from an enterprise level for over 25 years. So the question becomes, how does the server know what to serve? How does it know whether to serve that static page or that parsed or pre-processed page? And the answer to that is the ColdFusion file extensions. There's 3 of them. There's .cfm, .cfc, and .cfml. If the web server sees that as the file extension of the file that the person has requested, it knows, oh, this file needs to be pre-processed by the ColdFusion server before I can send it back to the user. Now, a quick note on .cfml, it works. I've never seen anybody use it. I've been developing pages for over 20 years, and every page that I've ever seen is either .cfm or .cfc. But .cfml is a valid ColdFusion file extension. Now, I want to take a quick fork in this road. People sometimes ask me, why don't you call it dynamic? You notice I'm avoiding the word dynamic and using parsed or pre-processed. ColdFusion pages are parsed on the server, and static content gets delivered to the web server and subsequently the browser. There are more dynamic front-end technologies that provide a more dynamic user experience, like Ajax, like Vue, React, Angular. These are having constant communication with the back end of the system to be able to get new data. And really, these could be receiving data from a ColdFusion back end. But ultimately, the end result of almost any ColdFusion request is a static HTML file. And I have the asterisk there because ColdFusion can return data in many different formats. It's a modern language, lots of different capabilities, depending on how it's used. So to say that it's a static HTML file is not entirely accurate. It's static data. But anyway, that's all beyond the scope of this presentation because we need to get back to my little midnight problem here. So I'm going to share with you the 3 lines of CFML that changed my life. Okay, and this was to prevent me from losing sleep by having to stay up till midnight, manually change the date on the website, and then re-upload it. So I started with a CF output, and then I created a date format now tag function, and then ended with a end CF output. That was it. That's all I had to do. Put that on the page, stayed up until midnight, was pressing F5, I think, on Internet Explorer 4, I want to say. And sure enough, at midnight, the date changed. And I thought that I was a god. Now, like I said, ColdFusion markup language consists of 2 different kinds of codes. There's tags and there's functions. So I'm going to break down that code that I just showed you and show you the little components. So I started with a CF output. That's a tag. This end CF output, that's also a tag. The line in the middle, the second line, that's a function. That's a function called date format. But it also contains a second function nested within it, the now function. And what that does is it says, take whatever time it is now on the server and format it in a month, day, year, long year format, right? Let's talk about CFML tags for a second. There's around 170 of them. They're all surrounded by greater than and less than signs. They all start with CF. Some tags have attributes, some don't. Some tags have closing tags, some don't. The best place to find all the information about the CFML tags is the Adobe documentation or cfdocs.org. Great resources for learning about all of the CFML tags that are available to you. Some of the common CFML tags that you'll see are like CF output for telling ColdFusion where to parse the content within the tags. If, else, if, and else give you if, then, else logic. You know, if this, do that, otherwise do this. CF mail for sending emails through ColdFusion. CF query for executing SQL commands against a database. A lot of backend integration. CF loop you can use to loop over lists, arrays, queries, all sorts of things. CF include, you can use CF include to include one file within another file. I mentioned that some tags have attributes and some don't. So I wanted to give some examples of those. For example, the CF query tag uses these attributes, name equals, data source equals, in order to define additional parameters like the database connection you use, the name of the result of the query. CF include uses an attribute called template that tells it which file to include at that point of the code. CF logout is another tag that has no attributes whatsoever. There are some tags that have no attributes. Let's talk about CFML closing tags. So when you look at CF output, each tag, most tags, have a closing tag. So for example, the open angle CF output, end angle, and then open angle / CF output, that would be the closing version of the tag. The CF output tag has to be closed so that ColdFusion server knows where to stop processing the CFML within. The CF mail tag needs to be closed so that the ColdFusion knows where the email ends. CF include, another tag, doesn't need to be closed. All it is include this file here. Let's talk about CFML functions for a moment. There's over 700 of them. They do everything from data manipulation to database connections to page relocation. They do much more. They all follow a similar pattern of function with parentheses, the name of the function with the parameters contained within parentheses. Like tags, some functions have attributes. Functions do not need to be closed. Some common functions, date format for formatting a date, array new and struct new you can use for creating arrays and structures. And that's actually, there are many ways to be able to create arrays and structures, but this is a function that will create them for you. Hash is another function for creating a one-way hash of string data. You can use the replace or replace no case functions for replacing a substring within a string if you needed to. If you had a big long string and you needed to remove all the dashes, okay, just use the replace no case function or replace function. Functions can have attributes. For example, my date format earlier had two attributes. The first attribute is the date that was being formatted. The second attribute was the mask that you were applying to that date. The array new function uses an attribute to determine what kind of array to create, whether it's a one-dimensional array, two-dimensional array, so on and so forth. And then the now function is a function that has no attributes. You type the now function, that's it. It tells you what date and time it is on the server. Some other details about CFML, pound signs or hashtags, depending on what century you were born into, damn millennials, are used to tell ColdFusion server where the parsing begins and ends for a particular piece of code. Remember that ColdFusion code is parsed server side. So the information that is used is information that's on the server. So for example, if you do time format now, it's going to return the time on the server, not where the user is. That can trip some people up sometimes. CFML is also just in time compiled or JIT compiled. There's no need to compile your CFML code. It gets compiled at the moment of the request. The moment somebody makes a request to that page, the ColdFusion server parses it in real time, provided it's not using a cached version, and will deliver that straight to the user. There's no need to pre-compile your CFML. So like I said, ColdFusion markup language can be written in two different ways. Excuse me one moment. It can be either tag-based or script-based. Now, I'm going to give you two examples of both tag and script base, CFML. Both of these examples do exactly the same thing. So let's look at the tag-based example. I'm going to set an array of colors, and I'm going to append to that array different values of red, green, and blue. Then I'm going to create an unordered list. I'm going to loop over that list, or loop over that array rather, and I'm going to display the color. So what should end up on the page is a bulleted list that says red, green, blue. Looking at a script-based example, and I'm going to throw a little bit of a curveball in there. I'm going to use JavaScript notation to be able to create the array. So I'm creating an array of colors and adding values to it all at the same time. Then I'm going to use the write output function to be able to write my unordered list tag. And then I'm going to loop over it and output each of the bullet points. Both of these blocks of code do exactly the same thing, but they're written in different ways. And some developers might be more familiar with script-based. Some developers might be more comfortable with tag-based. So a lot of people ask, which one should I use? Which one's better? Honestly, there are no rules. It's all up a matter of preference. Tags and script are functionally equivalent. Neither one is faster than the other. You can feel free to use one or the other, or a combination of both. It's all a matter of preference. There are generally accepted rules in the community that say that ColdFusion components, if you're getting into object-oriented programming, components should all be written in script, whereas views should always be written in tag-based. But again, all a matter of preference. You can use one, the other, both. You can mix and match. It's whatever works for you. So again, let's take a look at what my little code read. It read CF output, date format now, and I changed the date mask a little bit. How ColdFusion is going to interpret this is it's going to say CF output. I need to process everything from here to the end CF output. The date format now says format the results of the now function using the full date, full month, single digit date, and the full year. And then the end CF output says I can stop processing now. And what gets returned to the browser was today's date. That fixed my problem of being able to put the date at the top of the website. Now, there is a psychological effect called the Dunning-Kruger effect that basically says from the moment you know nothing, all the way over on the other side, to the moment you become an expert, your confidence level changes. And effectively what happens is you start off knowing nothing, and then you learn a little bit about a subject matter, and your confidence just goes through the roof. And then the more that you start to get to learn, your confidence kind of craters. And then over time, that curve kind of evens out, and eventually you become an expert. Well, at this moment, after I'd written these 3 simple, stupid lines of ColdFusion, I was up here on what psychologists like to refer to affectionately as Mount Stupid, because my confidence was way up, but I really had just scratched the surface of ColdFusion. Little did I know that I was about to fall down here into what they refer to as the Valley of Despair. Because again, didn't take long before the president of the company came up to me and said, David, I want listeners to be able to make song requests online that get sent directly to the on-air studio via email. And I said, okay. Here I am down in the Valley of Despair because I have no idea how to do this. So then I started learning about how to send email through ColdFusion because ColdFusion does a lot. And I created 2 files, a form and an action page. The first file, the form, I started off with an HTML form. And I said, this is going to post to the action page. Then I put a label for my name, put an input box, a little text field that says, what's your name? And I said, what song do you want to hear? Input box for the song. Then I said, label for the artist. What is the name of the artist you want to hear? And then a submit button. Then I ended my form. Pretty basic HTML form. My action page started off with a CF mail tag. And I said, I'm going to send this mail to requests@comp.com. It's going to be from website@comp.com. The subject is going to be song request. The type, it's just going to be a basic text email. And then I ended the CF mail tag. So that's the start of the mail tag. Then within the body, I'm going to vaporize myself here so you can see the code a little bit. In the body, I said, whoever the name is on the form would like to hear this song by this artist. And then ended the mail. And then I said, thanks for the request. Pretty basic, you know, here's a form, here's an action. The action page sends the mail to the studio. But we had a little bit of a problem. See, that form.cfm didn't have any sort of validation or anything on it. So we were getting a lot of requests coming into the studio that were blank. You know, people would just hit the submit button without filling in the form. So I said, okay, I want to have some sort of validation on this that makes it so that the person can't just submit the form without getting some sort of message until they fill it out properly. So what I did was I changed that to what's called a CF form. Same attributes as the HTML form. I had the same label, and then I changed my inputs from regular inputs to what are called CF inputs. And I added a couple of extra attributes. Required equals true, message equals song is required, you know, the artist was required, and it sends the person a message. And then I had my submit button. By changing this form to a CF form, I automatically built in validation simply by adding a few attributes to some of the tags and changing the tags from input tags to CF input tags. So meanwhile, here I am on what I call Mount Stupid the sequel, because now I think I'm a genius. Now, to be clear, modern web development discourages the use of ColdFusion-based UI components like CF form. There are libraries and things out there that do it differently, that do it better, that aren't as complex as they may add complexity to the development process, but they're more robust ways to be able to handle user interface than the ColdFusion tags that handle user interface. Nobody uses CF form anymore, basically, I guess is what I'm saying. Anyway, so I'd solved that problem. Suddenly I have a radio executive come up to me and he said, hey, you made a website for the radio station. Can you make one for my advertising client? And I said, well, sure, but I'm not going to do it for free. And he said, okay, how much are you going to charge me? And I'm sitting there thinking at the time, mid-90s, how much am I going to charge for a website? I said, $300. And he said, all right, sure. You know, you can do that. That's fine. They need to collect employment applications and email them to their human resources department as PDF files, as pre-populated PDF files. And that's when I realized that scoping your projects is really important. And again, here I am down in the Valley of Despair. But eventually, I did figure out how to get to a point where I started to have the confidence, the expertise, and the experience to be able to really be proficient in the various uses of ColdFusion. Now, quick break. Does anybody have any questions about ColdFusion or CFML basics? I'm checking the YouTube chat just in case anybody says anything. That's true, Charlie. That was a challenge. Okay, I'm going to move on. Now, to be clear, we have only scratched the surface of the capabilities of ColdFusion. ColdFusion does everything. It does a lot when it comes to being able to interconnect systems, interconnect computers, provide dynamic experiences to users, pull information from databases. Like, there's a lot that you can do with ColdFusion, especially modern ColdFusion. Let's talk briefly about the major ColdFusion frameworks. Starting off with, what is a framework? A framework is coding standards and rules that define how an application gets built. Now, that's all fine and good, but the code is more guidelines than rules, because any good framework doesn't lock you in so hard that you can't break the rules of that framework in order to be able to get done what you need to get done. So I like to say that coding standards and guidelines that define how your application is built, rather than absolute hardcore rules. Some of the advantages of using a framework: they do set coding standards. They can remove overhead from the development process. They clearly define where your code should exist. They assist in knowledge transfer. So if you have multiple developers working on a project and they both know the framework, it's easy to say, hey, I know the framework, so I know how this application was built, which promotes a multi-developer approach. Some of the disadvantages of using a framework, many times it can be overkill. I didn't need a full-blown framework for my stupid little CF mail form. And adding that would have produced a lot of overhead that was just too much for what it was that I was doing. It can limit the way that software is developed, although it typically won't. It can add overhead to the development process. Again, if I put a framework on my stupid little CF mail form, it would have taken me 10 times as long. It can obfuscate or add layers of complexity to your code base. Much like ColdFusion itself, a development framework is one tool in a very large toolbox. So use the practice that works best for your business. Try out frameworks. If you like a framework, if it works for your business, if it makes you more productive, then use it. If it doesn't, then don't. I know a lot of developers who say, yeah, I build my own frameworks because I like building things the way that I want them, not the way a framework dictates that I should build it. That being said, there are a lot of advantages to using a framework. Some of the modern ColdFusion frameworks, there's ColdBox, created by Luis Majano of Ortus Solutions. It's widely accepted as the de facto standard for CF frameworks. Amazing framework, does a ton for you. Framework 1, also known as FW1, was created by Sean Corfield, maintained by Stephen Nealand, I think still. Correct me if I'm wrong there, Charlie. It's dubbed the Invisible Framework for its lightweight footprint and ease of use. And then CF Wheels is an open source framework similar to Ruby on Rails. Those are the three modern ColdFusion frameworks that still have some development, that are still being widely supported. Some of the legacy ColdFusion frameworks you might hear about are Fusebox, Mach 2, and Model Glue. These are older frameworks that may have fallen by the wayside or are no longer being supported. None of them are being actively maintained, although there are Fusebox, Mach 2, and Model Glue applications that do still exist out there in the wild. So if you're doing development for another company, you might see those out there and say, oh, hey, wow, Mach 2, great. Let me get out my old books. Anybody have any questions about ColdFusion frameworks? Not hearing anything. Okay. We'll circle back at the end just in case. Let's talk about some ColdFusion resources. And when I refer to ColdFusion resources, I'll talk about IDEs and code editors that support ColdFusion. We'll talk about companies that specialize in ColdFusion development, some companies that specialize in ColdFusion hosting, documentation and learning, websites, industry expert blogs, social resources, employer and job seeker resources. That's kind of an important one. Finding ColdFusion developers can sometimes be a challenge. Finding ColdFusion jobs can sometimes be a challenge. And then conferences and events. So the difference between an IDE and a code editor, really quickly, is that an IDE is an integrated development environment. It's a set of tools that work together. It contains a code editor, syntax highlighting, compiler, debugger. It's, a lot of times an IDE is all of the tools you would ever need to build software put together. Whereas a code editor is a lot more simpler and streamlined. They do a few things and they do them well. However, every major code editor now can be extended through plugins and extensions to effectively make them as powerful as IDEs. Talking about the IDEs and code editors that support ColdFusion, there's Adobe ColdFusion Builder is the official IDE of ColdFusion. It runs on Windows, Mac, and Linux. It's an IDE built off the open source Eclipse integrated development environment. In my opinion, ColdFusion Builder is kind of like driving a Mack truck to go get groceries. It's way overkill for what you need. I just need a little hatchback to go get groceries. I don't need an 18-wheeler to pull up to the front of the grocery store. CF Builder does everything, and it's amazing. But it's, again, 99% of the features, from my perspective, I never even use. It's a commercial product, $300 basically for a perpetual license. The next editor is Microsoft Visual Studio Code, VS Code. Runs on Windows, Mac, and Linux. It's a code editor based on the Electron framework. It has extensions for anything you would want to do programming-wise, not just ColdFusion, but every other programming language also. And, also Docker and Git, and you name it. It's got extensions for it. It's open source, runs on the MIT license, so it's free. If you're trying to decide which editor to use, pick VS Code, because the next generation of CF Builder is going to be a VS Code plugin. Adobe's going all in on VS Code for CF Builder, so that seems to make sense to me. The next editor out there, and these are all a matter of preference, is Sublime Text. Has very good ColdFusion support, runs on Windows, Mac, and Linux. It's a code editor built using Python. Again, has extensions for almost anything you'd want to do. It's a commercial product, $80 for a perpetual license, and a damn good code editor. You know, before I switched to VS Code, I used Sublime Text for years. Atom is another code editor. Again, runs on Windows, Mac, Linux, developed by GitHub, has extensions for anything you'd want to do. It's open source, so it's free. Some of the companies that specialize in ColdFusion development, of course, I'm CTO of Epicenter Consulting, so I'm going to mention us first. You know, we do a lot of ColdFusion development in both new development, migration projects, maintenance projects, legacy projects. Epicenter Consulting is a very good ColdFusion development company. Some of the other major ones that are out there, Ortus Solutions, of course, huge in their field, really pioneers in the ColdFusion community. They do great work. Foundio is another one you'll hear of, TerraTech, CF Web Tools. All of these companies specialize in ColdFusion development. There's many, many more varying in size and focus, everything from little regional shops or one-man sole proprietorships that talk about that, you know, specialize in ColdFusion. Lots of companies out there that do ColdFusion development. Some companies that specialize in ColdFusion hosting. HostTech, I would put at the top of the list for support for ColdFusion. They are definitely ColdFusion experts. In my opinion, their support has gone to the toilet over the last year. But from a support perspective of ColdFusion, HostTech is an amazing company. Media3 is another company that very much supports ColdFusion, CF Dynamics. All of these are hosting companies. Vivio Technologies, New Tech Technology Services supports ColdFusion, but I believe older versions, and they've had so many security issues lately that I can't really recommend them, but they do technically support ColdFusion, so I left them on the slide. Coalesce is another company that supports ColdFusion via Amazon Web Services. They have an Amazon Web Services AMI that runs ColdFusion, and you can spin that up and pay hourly. There's many more hosting companies out there that support ColdFusion. These are the major ones. There are small regional hosting companies that do it. And of course, you can always purchase a ColdFusion license and bring it to whatever host that you have. Regarding documentation and learning for ColdFusion, there's Adobe's official ColdFusion documentation. cfdocs.org is another great documentation resource created by Foundio. It's community supported. It's a wiki. LearnCFinaweek.com, great resource for self-guided tutorials on all things ColdFusion. And it was recently updated over the last year to have all sorts of new information and modern approaches and so on and so forth. LearnCFinaweek.com is a great resource for new developers. CFcasts.com is another video-based subscription service offered by Ortus Solutions. Some of their videos are free. If you want access to all the videos, it costs $25 a month or $275 for a year. But a good resource for a lot of different videos on how to do things using ColdFusion and ColdBox and different solutions. Let's talk about some websites and industry expert blogs. There's the ColdFusion Community Portal at coldfusion.adobe.com. Charlie and I are both very active on that. The Epicenter ColdFusion blog, we have our own that where we discuss different ColdFusion topics and little gotchas and hints and things like that. Charlie, of course, has his own website that is an amazing treasure trove of information that gets really detailed. Charlie has never been told that he doesn't talk enough. Ben Nadel's website. Ben was actually one of the founding members of Epicenter Consulting. He helped found the company. And his blog is at bennadel.com. He blogs proficiently about ColdFusion and different challenges that he has. Ray Camden's website might be getting a little long in the tooth. He doesn't blog as much about ColdFusion anymore, but there still is valuable information in there. Brad Wood, I always butcher his name, so I always just call him Pete Freitag because people will always say, oh, David, it's Freitag or whatever it is. And I will forget 2 seconds later. So I always call him Pete Freitag. He's the founder of Foundio and blogs a lot about ColdFusion. Michaela Light, who is a great champion of the ColdFusion community. She blogs on the TerraTech blog. Some of the social resources for ColdFusion. Check out Adobe ColdFusion Summit, cfsummit.adobeevents.com. It's been going for 7 or 8 years now, I guess 8. This will be the 9th year. The Ortus community at community.ortussolutions.com. There's a CFML Slack channel if you use Slack. There's the ColdFusion Programmers group on Facebook that has a lot of members in it. And then, of course, online ColdFusion meetup. You're here right now, so you know about this one. Some employer or job seeker resources. If you go to the CFML Slack, there's a jobs channel that does receive a lot of information about ColdFusion jobs that are available in the community. The ColdFusion job resources and CF remote jobs groups on Facebook are 2 different communities that focus on jobs that are available in the community. GetCFMLjobs.com, another site, should be pretty self-explanatory. And then, honestly, CF Summit. I've heard of many people who have said, yeah, I got a job because of a guy that I talked to at Summit. Some of the conferences and events, again, there's CF Summit East and CF Summit West. It's hosted by Adobe, typically held in Washington in the spring and Vegas in the autumn. 2020, of course, was completely online. cfsummit.adobeevents.com is currently displaying 2020 information because this is around the time of the year that they start announcing them. So I expect that will be announced very soon. Into the Box, another big conference hosted by Ortus, typically held in Houston in late spring. 2020 was online. I suspect 2021 will be too. I believe they've already announced that it's entirely online. And then CF Camp, typically held in Munich in autumn. If you feel like going to Europe, I've never been. I heard it's a great conference. cfcamp.org is the information for that. Anybody have any questions about ColdFusion resources? I'm catching up on the chat here. Yes, Michaela is on LinkedIn very often as well. Okay. Let's talk about some facts and misconceptions. We got about 15 minutes remaining, so I'll try to wrap this up. Some facts and misconceptions about ColdFusion. The first one that I hear people say all the time is ColdFusion is a dead language. And honestly, this is an outright lie. I've been told this from the moment I picked up ColdFusion in 1999, and I've built a very good career out of that quote unquote dead language. ColdFusion is enterprise supported. It has constant versions being released. It is supported by one of the greatest technology companies, Adobe. It's not a dead language. However, finding qualified ColdFusion developers can be challenging. I think this is true. We are a small community, but we're a passionate community and we're a talented community. These are world-class developers that are using ColdFusion as their build platform. Another misconception is that ColdFusion is not an object-oriented language. This is true. ColdFusion by default is not an object-oriented language. However, some people take that to mean that ColdFusion cannot be an object-oriented language, and that's false. ColdFusion can be as object-oriented or not object-oriented as you want it to be. So when you hear some people who are talking about programming and development and saying, oh, we have to be object-oriented, so therefore we can't use ColdFusion, that's just a falsehood. You can build ColdFusion in a very object-oriented way. Some enterprise companies are not using ColdFusion, is another assertion of ColdFusion that I hear a lot. This is false. As a matter of fact, enterprise companies absolutely use ColdFusion. In the Fortune 100, they say that 72% of those companies are using ColdFusion. Of the Fortune 500, 63%, and this is according to an Adobe 2020 customer survey. Of those customers, they asked who rates ColdFusion as their most important technology. 70% of them said they do. And 70% also said that those customers are using ColdFusion for new development of projects. So to say that enterprise companies don't use ColdFusion is just not accurate. It's got 100% market penetration in aerospace, defense, apparel, industrials, media, motor vehicles, parts, telecommunications, transportations, wholesale. You name it, ColdFusion is there. Another assertion of ColdFusion is it isn't as secure as other languages. This is false. As a matter of fact, let's take a look at some reported security vulnerabilities by platform between 2014 and 2018. And we'll take a look at four of the big ones like .NET, Ruby on Rails, PHP, and ColdFusion. .NET did moderately well. They had 45 security vulnerabilities. Ruby on Rails clocked in at 38. PHP kind of surprised me. I thought that PHP was very secure, but clearly not, in that they had 210 excuse me, security vulnerabilities during this time frame, and ColdFusion had 17. So to say that ColdFusion isn't as secure as other languages is a misconception in my mind. Another assertion is that small companies or startups can't afford a ColdFusion license. I think this is both true and false. It's true that a new enterprise ColdFusion license costs close to $10,000. It's like $9,500. The non-enterprise version, I think, is about half of that. So for a small business to be able to say, hey, I need ColdFusion to be running on my server, but I can't afford $10,000. Yeah, it's true. You might not be able to afford that. However, the first question that I have is, are you adverse to open source software? There is an open source ColdFusion engine called Lucy that is absolutely free to use in a production environment. So it's possible that you could paint yourself into a corner and say, yeah, I want Adobe ColdFusion and I only want ACF and not Lucy, but I can't afford the licensing fee. Okay, yeah, you can't afford a ColdFusion license. But if you can afford open source, or if you can decide to use open source, you can get into ColdFusion very inexpensively. Anybody have any assertions about ColdFusion? I'm going to get caught up in the chat here. Yes, Charlie, I will add that. That's a good point. There's a modern certification program that I've taken that's offered by Adobe for ColdFusion. It costs $500. It's taken completely online. You get a handy little certificate at the end of it, which I'm looking at over on my wall here. Any other assertions that anybody has any questions about? Okay, I'm going to move on. In today's session, we discussed the basics of how the web works, the basics of how ColdFusion works, some simple ColdFusion syntax, some of the major ColdFusion frameworks, an overview of the ColdFusion developer community and how to find some ColdFusion resources, and some facts and misconceptions. So I always like to end on a quote. I'm going to say, no matter where you are in your development journey, you have to start somewhere. This is where I started. It was a long time ago. ColdFusion's been making things easy for coders for over 25 years. And maybe it's a tool that you can use to, chase that little balloon that I was talking about. Does anybody have any final questions?
I'll go ahead and hop in and say that most of the questions have been answered. If anybody has a question that they feel didn't get answered, feel free to type it in again.
Yeah,
and thanks.
I get a little
Thank you. Yeah, no problem.
If anybody ever wants to reach out to me, it's david@epicenterconsulting.com. I love to talk about ColdFusion, so feel free. It's one of my passions. So.
And you okay with sharing your Twitter handle?
Oh yeah. Yeah. It's at Pegarm, Pegarm as in Mike. I'll give you the 2-second story on that. Back in the 1990s, I had surgery on this shoulder because I used to be able to go like this and it would fall out of its socket. And I spent 6 months with my arm immobilized to me, and my friends said, "Hey, you're like a pirate, except instead of having a peg leg, you have a peg arm." And it stuck.
I always wondered about that. It's fun to hear the story.
Oh, there's a long, embarrassing story on that one too, but I'll tell you that one. It involves a nurse and there's nudity, and it's well.
Sounds like a Seinfeld episode. All right. Anybody else? We can't tell with StreamYard and YouTube. Maybe you could see it in YouTube. I'm actually not looking at the YouTube, but in the StreamYard, we can't tell if somebody's typing. So
Yeah, you can't tell if somebody's typing.
while we're waiting, Troy made an interesting comment there, and I think it's worth expanding on. He said, we've said those exact same things for my entire 15-year career. And David and I can say for nearly 25 years, yeah, it's just so funny that we've heard so many of the same things over and over again. And it's not new. And yet people often think that the discussion is new and that it's unique and that it's different now than it used to be. It really isn't. It's been the same, and CF has just, moved along and evolved. And even Bob's last comment about what's the future of CF in Europe and saying that it seems mostly it's in US. And I'll just tell you, we've been hearing that for 20 plus years. Everybody always thinks that where they are, there's nobody and everybody's elsewhere. Of course, the US is a really big place. So even in the US, there'll be people say, well, there's nobody in my area. Well, there's probably no CF people in most everybody's area. It's just, it's a big world, and the CF as a community might be in the order of thousands of people, maybe tens of thousands of people. And so when you spread that out across the world, it's going to always feel like there's nobody else but you. But that's why it's so valuable both to have the meetup and to have those communities that David shared. And that's really important to stress, that if you didn't catch it, for those who are, maybe, or just you're not thinking about that, just get involved in whatever online community sings to your heart, whether it's Facebook and the CF Programmers Group, or Slack and the CFML Slack, or the Adobe portal, or the Adobe community forums. Whatever means of communication you like to do, there's a community out there, and you can find a world of CF people that you can, learn from, commiserate with, kvetch with, chat with, get friendly with. And of course, and David made this point, yes, that means that when you're looking to hire, you have a hard time finding people in your particular locality. It is what it is. That is just true. And frankly, a lot of people would find that when they try to find good people in whatever technology they're in, people are just spread out. And so you either have to get people that are working remotely, which the world's changing, and that's an advantage in that regard, or get people. And I don't know if you addressed this, David, but it's another one that I'm sure you guys specifically even at Epicenter deal with, is sometimes rather than find people who are supposedly good CFML developers, sometimes old-time CFML developers aren't great. Right. Get a good developer in any language and train them up. Go ahead. You were going to say that?
Yeah. And that's one of the reasons why actually I give this presentation to begin with. We're a small community. I've dealt with companies for years that have said, if I put out a job requisition for a ColdFusion developer, I might get 2 or 3 responses. Whereas if I put out a requisition for a PHP developer, I'm going to get 1,000 responses. And it's hard to fight that without, also wanting to take an active role in growing the community. So that's why I give this presentation, is to bring more people into the ColdFusion fold and say, look, it's not dead. It's actively thriving. It's not only is it alive, but it's something that is an amazing tool. And I heard some people talk about, we want to go to Java instead. And I'm like, dummy, you're already doing Java. Like ColdFusion parses into Java files that runs on a JVM. So for you to say, I want to go to Java, you're already going Java. So yeah, I mean, it's fighting that stigma. I think that ColdFusion is the best language with the worst reputation I've ever seen. A lot of people, for whatever reason, have a stigma against ColdFusion. I don't understand it. And that's why I do these talks, is to try to break that a little bit.
Yep. And we could go on. There's so much we could say. These are topics that people who've been in the CF community for a long time have participated in discussions about over and over. And there's often several places where you can find elaborated discussions, both from people on the positive side and people on the negative side. So just know that you're not alone in whatever thoughts you have, to which a couple of things got brought up. A lot of CF user groups seem to have closed down in the UK, Bob mentioned. Well, a lot of CF user groups throughout the world and in the US especially have indeed closed down. That's, again, just the nature of the beast. There's just not, as much of an audience in any particular locale to justify the effort. So, I and others participate in a lot of groups all over the country. And so we can, attest that they definitely have many gone by the wayside. And that's, I think, also just another characteristic of a change in the way technology communities work. A lot of user groups have found that they can just do a lot online. But of course, online only isn't as good. I mean, this group right here is a perfect example where at least we're able to chat, and that's cool, but we're not able to talk to each other. We're not able to sit down and have a beer with each other. We're not able to go on too much longer than this time that we've allocated. So there's no question that being in each other's presence is a much better situation than this. But it is the nature of IT in general that a lot of groups are going that way. Up in Troy's mentioned in the Atlanta ACBUG, used to be actively involved in that. A couple other things that were mentioned before we lose track of them. William said more hosting. Let me just pop it up on the screen. More hosting with CF or turnkey cloud containers to spin up sites for clients, make it easier for freelancers to help make more sites for more customers. We should note, I don't think you did mention this, David, in your talk. You just didn't. I don't think it came up, but you've written on it. ColdFusion Docker images do exist from Adobe. Yep. And so there's Adobe ColdFusion Docker images for CF 2021 and 2018 and 2016. And if you just Google ColdFusion Docker, you'll find resources that I and David and Adobe have written. And, we're particularly active in helping people to use that. And David did a couple of great, I think it was 1-part and 2-part of what was to be a 3-part talk, right? Article series on the ColdFusion portal. So again, if you just Google ColdFusion Docker, you'll probably find them.
The third one came out.
Okay, good. There you go. Okay, I might have missed it, but I think I sensed that you had more in mind, and
yeah,
I'd love to see them because they were great. People really need, there's just so many people coming from different perspectives who either don't know anything about Docker or know enough to be dangerous or know enough to find the holes and problems and have unique challenges. And there's plenty that we could talk about. And that's another thing that I said that I'd be happy to have them come on and give a presentation based on those articles. That'd be awesome. And then guys. Bob mentioned, okay, I was waiting to see if you had anything to say. Go ahead.
I got nothing.
Okay. Bob says Adobe should bring out an open source version. Well, let's just again repeat in case it was missed. There is already open source CFML. Lucy is open source CFML. And you probably know that. Sorry, go ahead. David, go ahead.
What I said was lucee.org. I'll put that in
there. You go. Yep. And I was just going to say, Bob probably knew that, but he's saying specifically Adobe should bring out an open source version. Well, that's economics. As long as they're making millions and millions of dollars a year, and they are, otherwise they wouldn't have a very large team of people supporting it, and they wouldn't continue coming out with new versions every couple of years. I'd say as long as they're making money on it, the chances are pretty slim that they're going to open source it. But maybe eventually the economics will be such that it might make sense for them to do that. We'll see.
Well, and speaking to the longevity of ColdFusion, Adobe has at least 2 more versions, commercially supported versions planned for ColdFusion.
Exactly. And William chimed in about he's been trying to keep the Seattle CFUG active, but not a lot of traction with users to maintain excitement and keep growing. And again, it's not unique to that area. It's sad, because there have been a lot of great CF user groups over the years, but it is, just what it is. And we should, this is another point that David's making, is that none of that is really a reflection of CF itself being stagnant or Adobe not being in support. And some people want to turn that into Adobe could do more to support CF. Well, a lot of companies could do a lot of different things, and we could get into debates about that, but they're big boys and they make their decisions, and there's usually corporate things about that we don't even understand as active CF participants. So, I just accept that we can't move. That's a big ship, and we're not going to be able to get it to move. They're going to do what they're going to do, and they're not going to do what they don't do, and there's nothing we can do about that.
And from the community standpoint, I mean, we all have jobs, we all have families, we all have things that we need to do. It's difficult to take time to be. I mean, I would be a prolific blogger on the community portal if I had the time to write the damn articles.
Yes, I can attest to that. I have so many things I want to talk about. And you guys, if you don't appreciate it, to write a blog post, even if it looks like it's only 10 or 15 paragraphs, the time and effort it takes to think what to say, what not to say, how best to say it becomes daunting. And we often just go, yeah, someday I'll get that article done. What was that, David?
I'll do that later. I'll finish this
later. And I've thought about switching to doing YouTube videos or something.
And mid-sentence.
Sorry, I missed that.
I said I think I have 3 blog posts in the community portal, just in the chamber, that just end mid-sentence because I either got busy or somebody pulled me away or whatever. I didn't know where my mind was going with this. How do I present this information? I just said, I'll do this later.
Yep. So I was just chiming in then at the moment that you said that to say that I've thought about doing just YouTube videos because at least, people don't have the same expectation and you could just whip one together, and you've got that awesome studio there. So perhaps you're already either doing it or thinking of doing it. The only negative to that is that it's not easily found then, either to find it or to quickly get the information that was shared in it. Somebody might talk for 5 minutes saying awesome stuff. Well, if it was written down, it would be, 20 paragraphs, 30 paragraphs. And usually we read a blog post to learn from it. Well, if it's just in a video, it's kind of lost. And that's I lament about that. I'm really torn. You were going to say, David?
I wasn't going to say anything.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I was just agreeing.
Cool.
All right. I'll turn it over to you to wrap up.
Oh, you bet. I was just looking at the questions and comments. Yep. There have been different variants of CFML over the years, different engines that have come out. And on my cf411.com site, I discuss, list those. I list so many things. There's 170 categories of things and a couple thousand tools and resources. So keep an eye on that cf411.com for things like that. What CFML engines are there and were there, and what CF user groups are there and were there, and what CF podcasts are there and were there, and what job sites are there and were there. So there's lots of stuff. And I'll just say to echo again something that David said is that you might think because you don't hear about things that they don't exist, and that's another reflection of the quote problem with the ColdFusion community. But when you find these resources that do exist, it suddenly changes your perspective, and you go, oh, wow, there's a big community of people doing this or people doing that, and places I can learn this and places I can learn that. So again, I appreciate your giving this talk, David, to help that. I mean, I'll just say this too, because it was oriented the way it was, there's probably a bunch of experienced CF people who didn't get to hear this. You might want to think about a talk that, because I've done it over the years too, but I'd be happy to have, if you want to do it, or anybody in the community, if you want to do one, do a talk on highlighting those things for people without presuming that it's a 101 talk, because
right.
you're not going to attend.
Oh, that's a good call.
Yeah. So, all right. Well, it looks like the questions and comments have petered out, so we'll go ahead and call it now. And again, thank you very much for coming on and giving the talk, David.
Absolutely. Happy to help.
I hope we can get you on again.
Absolutely. I'll do it again.
All right, sir. Well, until again, so long, everybody. Talk to y'all later.